Hello folks, welcome to your next recorded lecture for HI121. This is The Original Tomb Raiders, a short history of early Egyptology. So, what are our key questions for today? So, I want to hopefully get us to the point where we understand why it is worth taking the time to understand the early history of Egyptology. It's a fascinating discipline that grew very organically, I think is probably the best way to put it. And it's interesting to look back and understand the different forces that had an influence on it in its early days, especially. I'd also like us to consider how archaeology is connected to imperialism and colonialism in the Egyptian context. I am a bit sorry that we're only doing one lecture because we were basically limited in what we can cover as a result. And I wasn't able to take us all the way up to the early 20th century where some of the most interesting stuff happened. Kind of a embarrassment of riches for this subject, you might say. All right, so I want to begin by surveying some of the earliest evidence for Western interest in Egypt. So we're going to look back to the beginnings of the early modern period here. So Egypt was conquered by the Ottomans in 1517, and it would actually be ruled by them for over 400 years. This immediately makes Egypt more accessible to Europeans because the Ottomans had various diplomatic relationships with European nations. So we do have numerous travelogues from the 16th century describing some fairly lengthy explorations of Egypt. Now, Renaissance humanism as a cultural movement also encouraged some of these tourists to take specific interest in Egypt's monuments. So one of our earliest examples is the 1610 visit of George Sandys. Now, he spent a year traveling around Turkey, Egypt, and Palestine. When he was in Egypt, he climbed the Great Pyramid and observed its interior, and studied the other two at Giza as well. He wrote a 4-book description of his travels in which he argued that the pyramids were not built by the Jews. That was, by the way, the prevailing theory at the time, that they were the granaries that Joseph had built, but that they were in fact tombs for Egyptian kings. John Greaves, another Englishman, built on this. Now, Greaves, in comparison to Sandys, was not a tourist. He was a genuine scholar, and he had the language skills to be able to read Greek, Arab, and Persian manuscripts. So he visited Egypt in the 1630s. He took various measurements of the pyramids and their stones, and created a really detailed cross-section of the Great Pyramid. That was used in his later work, Pyramidographia, from 1646. Now, he also identified a nearby temple as a funerary temple. Now, his ideas didn't really go over very well with his contemporaries. His book was definitely ahead of its time. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't all about moving scholarship forward at this point in history. The scholarly approach is happening at the same time as a sort of more mystic approach is probably the best way to put it. So I want to talk to you a little bit about Athanasius Kircher. So he was a German Jesuit priest who believed in Hermeticism. So if I was going to sum up what Hermeticism is, succinctly, it's an Alexandrian philosophical tradition from the earliest centuries CE, which actually claimed to be far more ancient. It wasn't. It was a later development. Now, later Europeans looked back to Hermeticism and saw it as a sort of weird foreshadowing of Christianity. So they were quite fond of it. And this is something you've got to remember about the early modern period. Mysticism was really all the rage. Seriously, you had court magicians in the early modern period. This was totally normal. Now, Kircher decided that Egyptian hieroglyphs were secret Hermetic symbols that only initiates could decipher. Thus, Egypt was the source of occult wisdom, and this becomes a really powerful idea in the Egyptian context. Not in the Egyptian context, in the European imagination, rather. The Egyptians were like, we don't really know what you're on about, just go away. It's sort of inevitable, I would say. Egyptian civilization still looks very mysterious to Europeans. And really, the Greek and Roman writers that the Europeans thought were all that also saw Egypt as sort of a mysterious, mystical civilization. Now, thankfully, despite this, we also see an increase in more scholarly exploration of Egypt between 1650 and 1800. There are many more travelers publishing books about their journeys. Some were just sensationalist travelogues, certainly, but there were a number that show a growing interest in actually understanding the Egyptian past. Now, Claude Sicard, who was a missionary, traveled to Egypt in 1712, but he spent most of his time not acting as a missionary, but recording information about monuments across the country. He was actually the first Westerner since an anonymous Venetian in the 16th century to reach Upper Egypt and Aswan. And in case anybody's not familiar with this, when you hear Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt is actually the more southern part of the country, because you're traveling away from the Mediterranean up the Nile. Lower Egypt is the more northerly part of the country. We know that Sicard measured, described, and studied about 80 different temples. He established that the Valley of the Kings was a royal cemetery, and he also established that the ruins at Luxor were in fact the ancient city of Thebes. Now, he intended to create a map of the Nile Valley with descriptions of every location in an accompanying gazetteer, and he does publish the map in 1722, but he died before he completed the gazetteer, and his papers were lost. We only have surviving fragments. And this is really kind of a pity, because he likely would have been regarded as one of the founding fathers of Egyptology if he'd managed to publish his work successfully. Now, I just want to mention two more travelers who followed him, who were influential in very different ways. So, Richard Pocock was an English clergyman who explored the country, then went home to England and became part of what was called the Egyptian Society. So here we see interest in Egypt is not just something that functions while you're on vacation. It is something you bring back with you to the home country, and you create clubs sort of revolving around it. And he publishes a guide to pharaonic monuments called A Description of the East and Some Other Countries. There was also a Danish naval captain by the name of Frederick Norden, who traveled up the Nile at the behest of his king. And he was actually the first to suggest that the pyramids were actually a lot older than was originally thought. He publishes a work called Travels in Egypt posthumously, and it included a really interesting illustration. There was a classical figure that was depicted as holding a staff with a Chi-Rho symbol. That's a Christogram, the first two letters of the name Jesus Christ. And the classical figure is surrounded by Egyptian ruins and pointing at a chained crocodile. So there is a very direct message in illustrations like that. The belief that by rediscovering Egypt, the West had mastered it. And this is something that underlies the West's attitude towards Egypt for a very long time afterwards. All right. We would be remiss if we talked about the origins of Egyptology and did not talk about Napoleon. Now, in 1798, the French government authorized an expedition to Egypt under Napoleon. The goal was to annex the country. Why? Well, specifically to undermine British influence in the Mediterranean. A secondary goal was to study Egypt's monuments in a more systematic way. You might say they were looking to intellectually acquire Egypt as well as to politically acquire it. Now, Napoleon brought many specialists along with him. There was a very significant number of printers so that he could easily publicize the work of the expedition. But he also brought two archaeologists, which was a bit of a novelty because archaeology at this point was still basically in its infancy. Now, he does take Cairo with very little effort and effectively takes command of the country. But then you get the Battle of the Nile, where Nelson beats him like a drum, and so he winds up stranded in Egypt for the time being, which allows him to focus more on the cultural goals of the expedition while he waits for the British to make their next move. So what Napoleon does is he founds the Institut d'Egypte, the Egyptian Institute, in a captured Mamluk palace. So this is where he houses his cultural specialists. So they take the time to investigate Thebes, to investigate Giza. But some of the best documentation from early on about the Great Pyramid comes from the work of Institute scholars. Now, Napoleon eventually slipped through the British blockade and went back to France and seized power, but he left the Institute behind in Egypt to continue their work until the British eventually took the country in 1801. Now, arguably, the work of the Institute is incredibly influential in sort of firing up the 19th century imagination about Egypt. The French leave behind a sort of a cultural consul general in Egypt, whose name is Bernardino Drovetti. And his main reason for staying was to export antiquities back to France, specifically to send them back to the Louvre. So of course the British have to compete with them on this. In 1815, after they finally defeat Napoleon at Waterloo, the British appointed their own consul general in Egypt, Henry Salt. And again, like Drovetti, he spent most of his time collecting antiquities for the British Museum. Also to sell, because the British didn't pay him a lot. And the two of them competed over who could get the nicest antiquities for about 20 years. It really is as awful as it sounds, guys. Like, there's what we consider to be ethical treatment of a culture's antiquities today. We may as well be aliens to the mindset that they had back then. Now, Salt kept losing out to Drovetti in the early years, and he finally did something smart from his perspective. And when I say his perspective, I mean not ours, because he should never have hired this guy, frankly. He appoints an agent to work for him, and this is the very famous Giovanni Belzoni. All right, I have to tell you a little bit about Belzoni. He has a very wild early life. He was a traveling peddler. He was a strong man who performed on the stage. Like, the guy's literally a giant. Then he becomes an actor and a stage magician. And at some point, he is hired by an envoy of the Egyptian government to help modernize Egypt's irrigation system. The reason for this is that he convinces that envoy that because he has a background in theatrical hydraulics, that he would be the perfect person. Yeah. Anyways. Now, when he's in Egypt, he meets a Swiss explorer, Johann Burckhardt. And Burckhardt actually lives in Cairo as a Muslim under an Arabic name. And he was particularly fascinated by Egyptian antiquities. We know that Burckhardt was actually the first person from Europe that we know saw the temple at Abu Simbel. He was fascinated by the site known as the Palace of Memnon, and specifically one of its colossal stone heads, which is dubbed at the time the Young Memnon. Now, it's very big. That's it in the image. Doesn't really show off the size of it. Napoleon's people had tried to remove the Young Memnon. It's a partial statue, basically a torso and a head. They couldn't move it. And Burckhardt actually thought, well, that was good, because he didn't think that the French should have taken it. He thinks it should go to the British Museum. And he tried to convince the Egyptian government to send it to the British as a gift. They were okay with this idea, and this is important to note, by the way. The Egyptians, in many cases in this early period, were just fine with shipping off their antiquities to win favors. It takes a while for them to realize this is not a good strategy. But they can't move it. So Burckhardt goes to Salt for help, and Salt is consulted just around the same time that he hires Belzoni. And Belzoni offered to get the statue up and down the Nile. So he hires 80 men, and they literally drag it all the way to the west bank of the Nile, get it on a boat for Cairo, eventually to the port of Rosetta, where it was transported by a cargo ship to Malta, and put on a Royal Navy ship bound for England. Now, its arrival in England was celebrated. The acquisition of the statue was seen as a sign of the extensive reach of the British Empire. And Percy Bysshe Shelley, the poet, admired it so much that he wrote his famous poem Ozymandias, which I will show you after this slide. Now, meanwhile, Belzoni had, of course, made his reputation by pulling this off. So he went on to open some of the pyramids and several of the tombs at Thebes, including the one belonging to Seti I. But he does have a falling out with Salt eventually, and he returns to England to publish an account of his time in Egypt. He ran an expedition of some of his finds in London that was quite popular. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Belzoni at our next lecture. He heads off on an expedition in 1822 to find the source of the Niger River, and he dies of dysentery at the relatively young age of 45. Now, he is certainly one of the greatest characters of early Egyptology, and should not have been allowed to touch antiquities. Let's just leave it at that. The story I'm going to tell you about one of the pyramids at Giza is pretty bad, for instance. Now, in Salt's defense, he does also employ agents who are a little bit steadier, a little bit quieter, a little bit more scholarly in their approach. So probably the best example of this is Giovanni Battista Caviglia, who's the good Italian as opposed to the bad Italian. He actually spends 20 years working at Giza under Salt's patronage. He is the one who excavates the Great Sphinx fully. He finds Roman ruins, as well as an important object called the Dream Stela. He also discovers an underground chamber in the Great Pyramid. He is not as well known as Belzoni. Belzoni got all the press. Of course Belzoni gets all the press. It's the same reason that Heinrich Schliemann got all the press. Now, Caviglia, did he contribute more to the cause of Egyptology? Absolutely. I think you can probably say that safely. All right, I also told you I would just give you a quick look at Ozymandias, and I'm just going to read this because this is actually a really cool little short poem. It has an interesting message about power, and it shows you how the Egyptian imagination, not the Egyptian imagination, the European imagination was captured by the Egyptian past. All right, I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." So just imagine being Percy Shelley, seeing this statue installed in the British Museum, imagining finding it in the Egyptian desert, the grandeur that it implied about the person that first created it to honor himself, and yet now it's just in pieces, now it's a ruin, now it's in an empty desert. What does that say about the transience of power? It's very cool sometimes how history and literature intersect like this. I couldn't resist sharing Ozymandias when we started talking about the young Memnon. All right. Now, of course, cannot talk about early Egyptology without talking about the Rosetta Stone. So it is actually discovered in 1799 when some of Napoleon's troops are at work on the defenses of Fort Julian, which had been a medieval fortress known as Rosetta. They found a slab of granite sort of used as part of the walls of the fortress, reused as part of the walls of the fortress, as often happens. Now, it contained a lengthy inscription in 3 sections. One section was hieroglyphs, another section was in Greek, another was a cursive script. So the Institute takes it under their protection and establishes that it was written in hieroglyphs, Greek, and Demotic. But they believed it could be a key to deciphering hieroglyphs. So they started to make prints of it and sent it off to Paris. Various scholars, both French and English, got their hands on the prints and began to work on the inscription. So it was, of course, dubbed the Rosetta Stone. It was sent to Alexandria in 1801. From there, it was supposed to be shipped to Paris, but after the British victory, of course, it was not going to be shipped to Paris. It went to London and was installed in the British Museum in 1802. Now, we need to establish a couple of things here before we talk more about the Rosetta Stone. First of all, hieroglyphs were not in use in Egypt after the 4th century CE. And really, they're not much in use for well before that. 394 is the date of the last hieroglyphic inscription known. And there's a long history of scholars misunderstanding what hieroglyphics are. These are even scholars from other cultures in most cases. Diodorus Siculus, for instance, was a Greek historian from the 1st century BC, thought it was a symbolic script, and his idea about this was so powerful that it stuck. And for 1900 years, most people assumed that hieroglyphs are symbolic. And so that kind of steered them away from effectively interpreting them. Now, Renaissance scholars were fascinated by hieroglyphs, but they, of course, were influenced by mysticism, so they didn't investigate systematically. They thought the key to the hieroglyphs was in mythology, and that the script itself was sacred. These perceptions are challenged, but they're challenged very gradually, and usually by single scholars, whose work doesn't necessarily take hold. Now, by the end of the 18th century, you have a Danish scholar, Georg Zoega, who argued that they were actually phonetic. So he has introduced this into the popular discourse on hieroglyphs, at least. When the copies of the inscription on the Rosetta Stone were widely in circulation, there are 2 scholars in particular who play a really important role. One is Thomas Young, who is British. He studied ancient languages, but he was actually a physician in his everyday life. He also was a physicist. These 18th, 19th century scholars sometimes they did too much. He wrote important work, for instance, on the human eye and the wave theory of light. But when he heard Napoleon speak about Egypt, he became fascinated with ancient languages, and specifically Egyptian script. Now, he's the one who suggests that hieroglyphs and demotic are actually connected, and that they may actually be both symbolic and phonetic. Now, he did not guess that even hieroglyphs were hybrid script, but his work does establish that some of the demotic signs are phonetic in nature, and also that there are some similarities between demotic and hieroglyphic script. And so his work is used by those investigating inscriptions in the country. The more well-known scholar involved in the translation of hieroglyphs is, of course, Jean-Francois Champollion. He was a genius. That's probably the safest way to put it. He had a great passion for Egyptian history and culture. He was a very fine scholar. He learned Coptic and argued that Coptic, which was a modern Egyptian language, was connected to ancient Egyptian. Now, he studied in Paris, he taught at the University in Grenoble, and nearly got himself killed because he was the ringleader of a Bonapartist rebellion. Thankfully, he had some supporters in academia who ensured that he was charged civilly instead of criminally, but politically he's ruined and he loses his teaching job. So he has nothing to do for 14 months and decides, okay, I'll crack the Rosetta Stone. Because, why not? Now, he finally manages to do this in 1822 by using cartouches from the temple at Abu Simbel to check correspondences between Coptic, hieroglyphic signs, and known Egyptian history. So he realizes that the hieroglyphs are a hybrid script, and he's able to successfully decipher the Rosetta Stone. Now, what's interesting is that he and Young actually had some friction. Young didn't feel like Champollion respected the earlier work he'd done, which Champollion had certainly built upon. And Champollion, being very French, doubled down with, no, I am the sole genius here. In the end, he did apparently have a conscience, and he sort of grudgingly recognized that Young had created the basic conceptual framework. But if we're being fair, it's Champollion's obsessive focus on the problem, and that problem alone, that let him crack it. Young had too many other interests. Young is taking part in creating the Encyclopedia Britannica, for instance. He also had less of an ego, so he didn't really defend his work as much as Champollion did. Now, Champollion had other political battles to fight, and he was eventually appointed as the world's first chair in Egyptology. He had his own expedition to Egypt, but died shortly after returning at a very young age. He was only 41, so he's not able to follow through with his own account of his expedition. He is recognized more or less as the founder of Egyptology, and there's actually a replica of the Rosetta Stone in the courtyard of his family home. And one of the roads that leads away from Tahrir Square in Cairo is called the Sharia Champollion, or Champollion Street. So even the Egyptians recognize his role. All right, to close things out, I want to take us into the modern period. So there is a continuing rivalry between French and English interests in Egypt. It's not all about antiquities. The country itself is strategically valuable, and exploiting it was lucrative. The cultural side of things remains part of that competition. And of course, Prussia joins in. Prussia, which was the forerunner to Germany. I could have actually done most of the lecture just on German scholars and what they got up to in Egypt. Suffice to say, they complicated the situation. Some were quite nearly as influential as some of the earlier names we've mentioned. But I want to shift for our last few minutes here to focusing on the later 19th century and what happened following the foundation of the EEF, the Egyptian Exploration Fund, in 1882. So Gaston Maspero was the director of the Museum and Antiquities Service in Egypt, had to deal with the British occupation of Egypt that same year. And as a result of the political situation, his budget is cut. And his budget is so badly cut that he was actually looking at having to give up the service's right to control excavations in Egypt. And whatever your political allegiance was, this was not a good thing. Because if the service stopped trying to regulate excavations in Egypt, it would be a free-for-all. And so many antiquities would be taken out of Egypt, they would just be lost onto the black market, never to be seen again. Now, Amelia Edwards, who was a British Egyptologist and quite a remarkable person, funded the EEF because she saw the problems developing in Egypt and she wanted to help. So one of the things she wanted to do was not just to bring in money, but to bring in a real kind of marquee archaeologist to head up some of the excavations, because then that would allow her to fundraise more money. So what she wanted to do was bring in Heinrich Schliemann, and Maspero was not okay with this. For those of you who are not archaeology students, you may not be aware of the fact that, yes, Heinrich Schliemann did find the city that we think is Troy, but when he excavated it with dynamite, because that was the thing that 19th century archaeologists did. So Maspero said, okay, no, not the German, just no, absolutely not. And asked her to find him an Englishman to train instead, someone who could eventually take over as director of excavations. She does find a British archaeologist that she thinks would be a good candidate, and he probably would have been, but he decided he had better things to do with his time. And Maspero's like, just for heaven's sakes, find me somebody young, somebody I can mold. So who they send is a young man who's not very young in that picture. That's one of his pictures from his older days. William Flinders Petrie, who is a brilliant but entirely self-taught archaeologist. Literally, he never attended university because of health issues. And he had already decided he was going to go to Egypt and start excavating. And what he did is he focused on small finds. So pottery, flint, stone vessels. He focused on understanding the little objects in archaeological sites. He wasn't all about the big buildings and the fancy art pieces. He was looking to understand the Egyptian past from a very fundamental level upwards. Now, he came back to Egypt on his second expedition in 1882 and was in a situation where he had no money. When he heard about the EEF, he wrote to Edwards, who thought he was a marvelous find, and introduced him to Maspero. Now, Flinders Petrie saw himself as doing salvage archaeology. He had very strong feelings about how many monuments were being taken or destroyed. He felt the real story of Egypt's past was being lost. So he sets new standards for Egyptian archaeology because he publishes his finds quickly and puts on constant small exhibitions rather. Now, the British Museum was just idiotic. It called his finds worthless. So he remained estranged from the British Museum for the rest of his life. He eventually withdrew from the EEF because he thought they were, too focused on the showpieces again. But he continued his work in Egypt because Edwards was solidly on his side, and so were other philanthropists. And he worked in Egypt for 40 years. He had more major discoveries than any other Egyptian archaeologist before or since, and he published hundreds of articles, reviews, and books. Probably one of his greatest contributions, arguably, was helping found the Committee for the Preservation of the Monuments of Ancient Egypt. Again, he hated seeing tombs and their decorations hacked up and sold. And the committee tried to raise funds to pay for guardians, inspectors, and flood protection. It didn't work very well. What the committee wound up doing was compromising with the French. It got some of what it wanted, but not all of it. And Petrie wanted it all. So Petrie resigned in disgust and wandered off. And he went back to digging. He fought with any official who didn't respect the sites and their monuments, and basically continued to establish Egyptian archaeology as a professional discipline. And his commitment to this, his commitment to preservation, and it's just the sheer duration of his time in Egypt and his influence, I don't think you can really understate the impact he had on how both Europeans and Egyptians approached protecting the Egyptian past in the end. He really was a remarkable figure. He was probably hell to work with, don't get me wrong, but what he accomplished was just incredible. Now, as much as I'd like to continue and maybe, take us up to Tut's tomb, I think that gives you a sense of how Egyptology evolved. I mean, it's a fascinating story. The history of Egyptology is a story of loads of unusual personalities and significant issues. It raises some great questions. How much ownership does a society have over its own past and the monuments of that past? It took Egypt a long time to recover its cultural legacy, to push back against the sort of exploitation that I was mentioning here. And these days, Egypt treasures its past. If you look back to the Egyptian Revolution in 2011, stories filtered out about ordinary Egyptians playing human shield. They literally created human chains around their museums to ensure that they were not looted, like what had happened in Iraq during the invasion. Now, this doesn't mean that archaeological theft doesn't happen in Egypt. Of course it does. It will always be a concern. But part of rejecting Egypt's colonial past has involved Egyptians reclaiming their sense of ownership over the pre-colonial past. And all you have to do to understand how successful they've been with this is to look at the way they celebrated moving the various antiquities to the new Grand Museum in Cairo. I don't know if anybody saw any of the footage of the parades of mummies and that sort of thing. They moved the boat from the Great Pyramid as well. The implicit respect there is really fascinating, and it shows you just how completely their approach to their cultural legacy has changed over the last couple of centuries, and more power to them for that, I say. All right, so that will take us to the end of that lecture, and stay tuned for another lecture on actual ancient Egypt this time, not just how we as modern people deal with it. Thanks, guys.